This is Joe Kopsick. It's April 10th, 2019, and the topic today is vulgar libertarianism. The term vulgar libertarian comes from Kevin Carson, who's a mutualist anarchist, a blogger. He wrote an article in 2005 on his blog, Free Market Anti-Capitalism, a mutualist blog, mutualist.blogspot.com. The article is called Vulgar Libertarianism Watch Part 1. And basically his definition of vulgar libertarianism is that vulgar libertarian apologists for capitalism use the term free market in an equivocal sense. They seem to have trouble remembering, from one moment to the next, whether they're defending actually existing capitalism or free market principles. So we get the standard boilerplate article arguing that the rich can't get rich at the expense of the poor, because, quote, that's not how the free market works, end quote, implicitly assuming that this is a free market. When prodded, they'll grudgingly admit that the present system is not a free market, and that it includes a lot of state intervention on behalf of the rich. But as soon as they think that they can get away with it, they go right back to defending the wealth of existing corporations on the basis of quote-unquote free market principles. So that is a problem with vulgar libertarians, and most of them are on the right and capitalist defenders and defenders of private property in the means of production. And that is against what the Europeans call libertarianism. It's against what libertarianism was 100 years ago, as far as everyone knew, basically when it was a euphemism for anarchism. So if you're a libertarian, you should admit that, if government is bad and, why would you think that, we should reduce the size of government by 90%? And then why would you not go all the way and get rid of it completely? I mean, maybe not government we should get rid of, but the state, definitely, because a statist mode of government, as I understand it, just kind of subjects government to monopolistic ways of doing things. And that is what causes all the rent and the interest and the profit to be extracted without being earned in the first place. And a lot of libertarians who are staunch defenders of capitalism and think they're real libertarians, they will sometimes say, what's wrong with rent and interest and profit? That's how you make money. It's no, that's how you make money without producing anything and without working. So if you realize that rent, interest, and profit, and egregious amounts of them, come because the state grants certain monopoly rights, like intellectual property and patents and registration of landed parcels of property, because the state helps enforce and protect that private property. That's why that private property exists in the first place. And then libertarians will be like, well, yeah, if my property is legitimate, then shouldn't the law help me? And shouldn't legislation, if it's legitimate, then the state should help me. It's well, yeah, you got to think about how the state protected the land claims of people who homesteaded and had slaves and stuff. How can you call it private property if the state's helping you protect and guard your private property? It sounds like kind of public. So maybe if there weren't that state help, you might want to argue here and there that the state makes it harder for you to keep that property by taxing and regulating you. You might have a point, but you would not have it in the first place without the state helping you, or else you would have to figure out how to convince literally 100% of people around you to unanimously agree that your property claim is just and earned. And you do have to earn it. You have to homestead your property, make it livable, and leave it in a better state than you found it, at least not let it fall into disrepair. You have to maintain frequent and active use. This is all standard anarchist and mutualist ideas. I'm not just making it up. But yeah, how can you protect two non-contiguous land or property claims at the same time without the help of the state or without the help of unanimous consent of all of your neighbors? You can't. So property is quite a public and social institution, capitalists. And you got to, you got to ask yourself, do you want a minimum regulation or do you want no regulation? And that determines whether you're a minarchist or an anarchist. And if you don't want less regulation and less taxation, you shouldn't belong, you don't belong in the libertarian movement. And if you think the state's job is protecting private property claims, and if you think it's only to protect private property claims, then that's stupid, because you would have to then admit that the state has, or the government has, no role or job or responsibility to protect human bodies. So you're basically saying that the government has a right to defend property over people and choose private property over people, and subject the ecology and people's labor to ordinary market forces as if they were dead pieces of material that you just, And here's the other thing: you pull resources out of the ground and you act like you created it. You might have done a little bit of labor to lift it out of the ground, but sometimes these people are lobbying for, they just want, if you only believe in private property rights to own things, then you logically cannot be in favor of voluntary association. Right libertarians, you can understand why they're against every socialist experiment, even if it's completely voluntary, because they do want to make sure that everything is privately owned. They don't like the idea of cooperative open access and use and sharing, because that throws the idea away that we need ownership, because their idea, how communism works. Here's how libertarians think communism works. That when you earn a bunch of money through rent, interest, and profit and monopoly security rights through a fake rigged economy, and you earn a bunch of money in a capitalist economy, and then you pool your money collectively with other communists who don't like that they're slaves and being subjected to an economic system that they don't agree with, and then is eating them alive. Libertarians think that you have to earn money in capitalism and then pull it collectively in order for it to be legitimate communist property and a voluntary association. And that's to ignore exactly what Kevin Carson is pointing out, which is that they think that we live in a free market now, when they admit they wouldn't be in our movement if they didn't admit that there's way too much state intervention. And I don't know what these people are thinking. Maybe they just think, it's a little bit too much state intervention. It's like, go be a Republican if you think that. We need way less. I mean, maybe have more regulation by communal institutions and voluntary associations and actually local governments instead of, state and federal governments and top-down, legislation and shit. And we could have juries and contracts decide more things than legislators. Of course, we can all agree on that. But you got to just nail these libertarians down and ask them, do you believe the market is rigged? And do you believe it is rigged through and through? And if you can admit that it is even the littlest bit rigged, can you admit that that little amount of rigging affects a whole lot of other industries? And you got to just point out all these examples, like all these things that businesses, they gripe about, the government doesn't protect my property enough because they tax me and regulate me too much. Like, they give you every right that you have to exclude people from your property at the taxpayer expense and have the cops come protect your property if someone's on it, which is just if they're challenging your property claim. It doesn't even matter if you're there. So it's like, you're the reason why we need the state or need government, because you're the one who's threatening human beings, your neighbors, with your property. You're using a tool, your private property, which is, not a living thing, to threaten living things, other people. What is the social good of you having private property? The whole purpose is to exclude people from it. You want to make money based on excluding people from things? That goes against everything I know about, how an economy works. You're not supposed to be able to earn anything or make money or make a profit unless you actually provide a good or service to people and convince them that what they're giving you is worth what they're getting back. It's supposed to be about equal exchange. And if you're about equal exchange and mutually voluntary beneficial exchange, like libertarians should be, at least if they know anything about mutualism and anarchism, which is the heart of libertarianism, then they should not give a shit about profiting out of every situation they can. Isn't it bad enough that we have people who try to profit off of every social and political situation they can, that we got to have people saying, I'm a libertarian, people should profit more off of economics. We should have more competition. No, we need more cooperation. We need more open access and use and collaboration. And you don't need the government to make things free. People already demand free things. And with automation and mass production, and in the future, improved distribution and energy systems, we will be able to deliver all kinds of goods for very, very cheap, almost free prices to everyone and anyone who wants them without government intervention, maybe even without market intervention. So, just look up post-scarcity economics and the word abundance, which you probably never heard in your fucking life, if you want to learn about why economics is such a necessary science. If we didn't have enough resources to be alive or support 7.5 billion people, we would be falling off the planet. The problem is that it's being hoarded and not distributed equally, and that the vast majority of all new wealth is being gobbled up by the 1%. I'm going to read some sections from this article on Rational Wiki from about vulgar libertarianism. Section called Libertarians as Corporate Mouthpieces, and this is going to explain a lot of the issues that right libertarians and vulgar libertarians get wrong and kind of fail to consider the anarchist side of things. What happens when you follow through and get rid of the state, but stay open to voluntary governance and are open to, markets without capitalism. Vulgar libertarians are those who focus on those parts of a free market policy that most benefit big business, such as privatization of land and commons, deregulation, corporate tax cuts, anti-environmental policies, free trade, liberventionism, aka regime change in the name of liberation, while ignoring other parts of liberty that would most benefit individuals and small businesses, such as civil liberties, legalization of drugs, meritocracy, open borders, tax reform, and eliminating corporate welfare. And I'm going to go through these, but I also want to add this as kind of a launching pad to what I want to talk about. Nor ought you ever expect them to question the very existence of limited liability corporations, which depends on the state's refusal to use or authorize force to collect some debts incurred by some actual persons, but not others. Nor do they object to the state's interference with freedom to make contract when it increases employers' power. This is all absolutely true. Because of intellectual property rights enforcement and protection and trade protections, trade promotions, LLC statuses, protection of the right to profit infinitely in the future, essentially the right to make money that you haven't earned yet, because keeping it legal allows you to project that you might eventually make some money. Like, we cannot legally defend the right of unlimited profit. That's the right to increase. That is the root of why we have high rents, high interest, and high profit. And if you think you're a free marketer and a libertarian and you want prices to be high, you're an idiot. Because the higher prices things are unnecessarily, the more the state's going to tax it, and the more it's going to look just when it does it, look right when it does it. But also price competition is supposed to lower prices. And with price competition, if we had price competition, I wouldn't need to cite automation and mass production so much to get you to realize that we could have free things without state intervention. But yeah, there's all kinds of monopoly rights that the state grants to private property owners and business owners and individuals who incorporate themselves. Like I said, IP, and also insuring with taxpayer money, insuring their bank deposits through the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or whatever the fucking C stands for. I don't even know. You never know whether something's private or independent as part of the government, or whether it's a public partnership. It's another part of it that some libertarians will call a government program like private if it's a tiny bit private, and they'll downplay the extent to which the state is completely involved in creating it and recognizing it and legitimizing it and protecting it in the first place, which is why it has all its money and why it's able to make money employing us, which is why they have us begging to work for them and buy their products. Because otherwise, without the threat of force against us and taxes and regulations, if we don't buy their products, and the threat of, you can't boycott Israel if you're receiving public money, and there's anti-competition contracts. They got us by the balls. Like, we can't fully boycott or strike anything. Look up the Taft-Hartley Act, which is still still being enforced after 70 years. It absolutely proves what this article is saying in Rational Wiki, Vulgar Libertarianism, that a lot of libertarians don't mind when the state intervenes in the economy, so long as it increases the power of employers, to keep people employed, to create jobs, right? No, to subject people to slavery, to coerce people into working longer and harder than they might otherwise would have if they only had to and only were able to support themselves. See, we're like, work harder. You'll be more independent if you work harder. It's like, if I work harder, you'll force me to keep working harder and work harder for you and harder for you every fucking day. So capitalism is about force. If you read Marx, you'll understand that, you know, a lot of these countries don't want markets or stock exchanges or definitely central banks. Libertarians are against central banks, except when some other country doesn't want ours. And that's when they come to support this liberventionism, regime change in the name of liberation. Oh, because every country wants markets. Every country's surplus labor force wants to be subjected to unnecessary labor for the benefit of international investors. You don't even need to fucking say anything else. Let's go to, I don't even know how far I got in this. Privatization of land and commons. Why should land be considered private? And you didn't make the fucking land. I know Obama says you didn't build that. Like, yeah, some people build their businesses. Some bosses do some work. Sure. I don't know. But like, you didn't, how can you privatize something that you didn't build? You can't privatize land. Land belongs to the commons because land and its full economic definition of land, air, and water and mineral resources are the common inheritance of all people on the earth to be shared equally. And to have a first come, first serve private property ownership system that's recognized with the state, it's recognized with the threat of legitimate violence used against people. I thought libertarians didn't believe violence was legitimate. Apparently, they just believe that the right to exercise legitimate violence can be privatized or contracted out to whatever racist asshole has a fucking business and a car and a weapon and a piece of land. Yeah, land is supposed to be common. You can have land be common without making it a public institution, and the pure public sector is different from the common sector. There's not just private and public. There's commons, there's clubs, there's personal possessions. Can't just reduce things to black and white. Deregulation. The description of this says food trucks whose only crime is competing with brick and mortar restaurants would benefit from deregulation. Yeah, we want deregulation by the state because it's incompetent and monopolistic and doesn't really allow for special circumstances and uses violence to enforce everything that it wants to accomplish. So if we can have less regulation by the state and more regulation through self-governance, self-control, self-regulation, and communal governance, voluntary associations, independent crafting of standards, and voluntary adoption of competing standards by different nonprofit, non-state affiliated actors. That's what anarchy is about, man. You don't need to have the state actively privatize something and hand over the public or common resources to some private owner in order to have privatization. There's active privatization and there's passive privatization. You can't have the state involved in a privatization project and call it private. It's publicly conducted unless the state gets out of the way by abolishing a bureaucracy and letting the people in whatever combinations solve that problem and provide those resources that the government was formerly providing, if they're even necessary in the first place, on their own. Third, corporate tax cuts. U.S. tax law has a bubble in its corporate tax rates that a small business will notice, but the Walton family can avoid without incident. That's true. The richest can afford to hire the best tax lawyers, and they can afford to hire lobbyists to change the tax laws to make it favorable to them. But I understand why libertarians would want to tax businesses less, but corporations are not ordinary businesses. Corporations have special statuses that they would only get from the state, and that is limited liability corporation status. And that confers a financial and legal protection and insulation from competition, challenge, and holding someone legally and financially responsible for their crimes on an individual basis. So it's just like the police. They can't individually be held liable for failing to protect us. Look up Warren versus DC. And the corporate tax cuts they get, yeah, some libertarians might want to be, that's just tax credits. Yeah, let's tax them less. It's like they're making profits off of the taxpayers' back through contracts, through IP rights, through patents, through trade promotions and protections, through FDIC insurance. All these, and they'll be like, some poor people get food stamps. It's like, shut your fucking mouth. Anti-environmental policies, including global warming denialism. I am so sick of libertarians who deny that climate change is real. I support what Gary Johnson said. He said, yeah, mankind has had an influence on climate change. That doesn't mean that we need government to solve it. We could have local governments, state and local governments, county governments, figure out their own plans. And, I think the more people learn about Georgism, the more enthusiastic libertarians will be about creating, replacements for federal environmental legislation in their own communities that can be exercised on a local basis without any fear that the federal government or the UN is going to get involved. And here's the thing: a lot of these UN environmental, resolutions, a lot of UN programs are completely participated in a totally voluntary basis. So the idea that our national sovereignty is threatened by voluntarily participated in UN programs and environmental agreements is just stupid, and it's got nothing to do with libertarianism. We can develop local alternatives to those federal and international legislation, but that doesn't mean that we should get rid of the ideas behind those legislations. Yeah, new growth and new income should be evenly spaced out geographically so that poor neighborhoods benefit. It's like, yeah, you need to have development that doesn't negatively impact the environment and kill endangered species. Of course. Like, there's conservationist conservatives out there. Why can't we get along on this? Free trade. Admittedly, it's a boon for businesses that couldn't exist under the old regimes, which enforced tighter regulation as well as trade restrictions, e.g., which means, for example, micro distilleries. Here's my take on free trade. NAFTA has destroyed the reputation of free trade, the term free trade. Free trade is a good thing. Free trade can happen without a treaty, which is what Gary Johnson says. Free trade can happen without government intervention. Free trade happens when the markets and the people and the firms in different countries interact with each other on a mutually beneficial basis, where they're fair multilateral treaties negotiated under the supervision of multiple governments. That just kind of almost invites international intervention. And it's kind of like, it's good if it can create a common trade zone to an extent, but if we're not going to integrate them monetarily, and I know we want to, but should we? Do they want the dollar? The dollar is full of fractional reserve and usury, and it's full of debt. It's going to collapse. Why do we want the dollar to be the world reserve currency? Are other countries going to want that if it's not a reliable currency? And I don't think it is. But back to free trade, you can't have free markets, fully interconnected markets, perfect markets, complete markets, without free flow of labor and capital everywhere, across all land, across everywhere, the whole surface of the earth. And borders cannot help but, and transportation, security checkpoints and everything, they can't help but intervene with and interfere with and inhibit and slow down the free flow of labor and capital. Like, I know you need to, be able to inspect cargo, and that can be done at on a fee for service model, and it is done now. You have to, inspect cargo to make sure slaves or hazardous material aren't being transported without your knowledge and awareness. I totally understand that. But just because, port inspections make sense, that doesn't mean that tariffs should be the only type of taxes or any wild conclusions you could draw based on, libertarians need to stop trusting Donald Trump on trade. He started a trade war. It's stupid. We shouldn't be in stupid little fights with Canada about the price of fucking milk. Everyone wants sugar. Everyone loves sugar. Everyone wants sugar to be inexpensive. And that is why sugar is the only, or one of the few items that, that's popular on markets that has no tariffs attached to it. And that's because people know that a tariff will only increase the price of sugar, and they want cheap sugar. Which just goes to prove what I've been saying. People want free, low-price stuff. And if people want that, then the market has to give something to address that demand for lower price free stuff. It's called price competition. And it's one of the benefits of competition that a lot of right libertarians don't really stress, because it results in less profit for well-connected monopolized interests. Liberventionism, regime change conducted by the U.S. military, all in the name of liberation, and buckets of aid to Israel and the Saudis to fight ISIS as well. That's a good point. There are a lot of libertarians who still listen to Donald Trump and take their cues from him. It's like, we got to fight ISIS. Like, we were just helping ISIS, and the second we stopped, Russia took care of them for us. And I don't know if UN or Israel or America or the EU is behind ISIS. Like, we don't know what the hell's going on over there. But, you know, some libertarians are just willing to think, you know, Israel's our best allies, the only democracy in the Middle East. Oh, wait, aren't we against democracy? Are we? I don't remember. Oh, and they have like a one-house legislature, so they're kind of communist, if you want to think about it. I mean, honestly, they're a good representative democracy. It's just that they're an apartheid state. And why should, you know, it's like the Nazis. It was totally socialized for its own people. But if you include the segment of society that's being excluded from all the benefits of that society, it's completely not democratic. It's certainly not libertarian. And neither is the regime governing Saudi Arabia. And neither was the American government libertarian when it created Al-Qaeda, part of which allegedly, possibly splintered into ISIS. So this article continues on Rational Wiki. While ignoring other parts that would most benefit individuals and small businesses, such as civil liberties, legalization of drugs, meritocracy, open borders, tax reform, eliminating corporate welfare. And there's a note, unless it's going to corporations funding your think tank. So yeah, libertarians are perfectly willing to promote corporate welfare and even to promote the turning of the Libertarian Party into a corporate entity. If you look at the way the theme was chosen for the 2020 National Convention, it was pay to vote. You vote with your dollar. That's the idea that a lot of libertarians want. You vote with your feet, you vote with your dollar. If there's a tyrant chasing you, just go to another state. If someone's taxing you enough, it doesn't matter that they're making it less free for you to live there and they're kind of a threat to you. Just go somewhere else. Well, you can't run away from tyrants forever. Eventually you have to stand somewhere and fight. Open borders, like I said, free trade and open borders and free markets have everything to do with each other. And while I'm at it, people will demand free things, low cost things, low price things. But there are a lot of people who care about fair trade and making sure that workers are fairly compensated. But like I said about automation and mass production, more things can be made with less human labor and eventually with a negligible amount of human labor, so negligible that people would eventually start donating it for free. That is why there will always be a demand for adequately compensated labor, but robots that don't get compensated because, they don't need to get compensated because they're robots. So we can absolutely proceed forward technologically without problems if people can just own the means of production and they can do so collectively and freely without it being called socialism, without them being accused of accepting government benefits. Because, even if you do what Andrew Yang's proposing, giving people a UBI from a tax on profits from technology to help people, get an income without being forced to compete against robots for jobs, which is a fucking nightmare. Even if you do that, that's still less general aid to the people than the long history of taxpayer-funded aid to corporations, which are printing our textbooks and propagandizing our children and teaching them to compete against each other for their benefit forever and calling that public education. So yeah, there's a lot of things we need to talk about. Meritocracy cannot exist in rigged markets. This description says many libertarians deny the wage gap. Absolutely. If you look at, it's only been 20 years since the state of Oregon repealed the No Blacks Allowed law. There was a law until 1997 that allowed black families to be caned if they refused to leave the state. That law was probably created a long time before that. But, the after effects of redlining still exist. they're still basically fair and, just neglected, overlooked, subtle discrimination against non-whites and definitely non-citizens in all kinds of, I had a relative tell me that they worked for a business in the South that it was probably the 80s, and they said, throw away the application, like give them an application, but don't give it to us if it's a black person applying. And yeah, that shit was illegal. But you know what? The government didn't care. So, I mean, this is all part of the conversation about, do we want no government or do we want some government and responsible government? And you also have to consider, right libertarians will point out, yeah, the Jim Crow laws were laws. Yeah, well, they wouldn't have passed if the business interests hadn't lobbied for them in the first place. And you know who mostly benefited from them? Business interests. It's called regulatory capture. Here's the thing: civil liberties. Libertarians like civil liberties when it comes to legalization of drugs, prostitution, and privacy. But it says, I am all for gay rights and interracial marriage, just don't expect me to bake a cake for you. Libertarians think they have the right to use their private property, their business, which, caters to the public, supposedly provides public accommodations. They think they can use that and just, when you go to work in a service economy, your job is not to make money off of excluding people, off of denying people goods and services. Your job is to show up and provide goods and services. You remember that Kim Davis woman who was like, I won't marry gay people because it's against my... Well, you were elected to do a job, and if you're not going to do your job, you should either be fired or you should go to jail if you refuse to be fired. If you see, now you're working for taxpayer money without actually working to earn it. You're just sitting in an office and be like, oh, all these gay people want to get married. I'm just going to sit here and fucking relax. Like, that's not your job. And in a service economy, excluding people from your property, there's no social benefit in it. How are you earning money off of excluding people? Because of this threat of state violence, that the cops will come to your property and exclude anyone who shows up and challenges you or asks to be served or whatever, when it's a place of public accommodation. The roads to it were built with public funds. Here's the thing, can't just privatize the roads immediately, because that makes it sound like you're going to have the state auction off the right to own the roads to private owners. Like, if you want private roads, you got to build your own roads, okay? If you want to have a successful business without the state helping you, well, first of all, you're going to have to create a little bit of land. You might have to seastead or reclaim some land from the sea because you didn't create the land in the first place. But that aside, if you manage to get the land, you're going to have to do something like homestead that property, make it livable, make it able to be occupied, and play some role in the defense of it, and not rely on the state and the state putting people into poverty all around you to make them desperate enough to consider working for you to protect your private property, when they should be at home protecting their own private property and protecting their homes and their families, which is the whole reason they exist. So why don't we pay people to stay at home and take care of their families? Like, you got to pay people. You got to induce people into, too much competition and working too hard to protect someone else's property claims that are non-contiguous, and that they would be completely unable to play any part in actually actively defending themselves because they're too busy fucking keeping track of all their money that's being protected in banks that are, that are subject to regulatory capture because of banking regulations. All the banks that exist, all the financial institutions that exist, they only exist because they're legal. And just like everyone we can buy from or work for, all those firms only exist because they're grandfathered in, because they already exist. They already demonstrated they can create some jobs. They demonstrated that they're, a reliable source of tax revenue, because these statists are all just like, they don't care whether someone's committing a crime and tax them because they might hurt someone or because they did, or, have redressive grievances by having them compensate the victim or something straight up like that. They're just like, no, if that thing moves, I want to tax it because I want to get the money out of that because I want that fucking money. It's like, you're not going to get a lot of production if you're just stealing the wealth of everyone. And, that's what government privatization, government-directed privatization results in. It results in huge CEO to average worker pay disparity rates Huge, $11 million to $11 an hour. That's what you're creating when you have bad government. And when you call that privatization, you give libertarianism and privatization a bad name. And when you support having Taft-Hartley still exist, which limits the right to boycott and engage in real strikes, and the right to have autonomous strikes, when's the last time you heard libertarians talk about a labor policy or propose their own labor policy or propose a way to get along with socialists or Democrats or anarchists or Georgists or anyone but conservatives and racists and nationalists? That's what vulgar libertarianism is about. It's this idea of libertarianism that focuses solely on capitalism and private property, doesn't consider that in a free market we would have a truly free market of governance, a free market of economic systems, i.e. the right to choose what economic systems we live under, which could change every day and really does change every day. Because think about all the mutualist credit institutions that we would, and the common lands we would access, and the personal possession that we would have, and the clubs that we're part of, and the cooperative ownership of firms, and everyone would also be an independent contractor that could join any union they want. There's no set economic system that any one person would be a part of in a truly free society. And when you have a free market society, you have a free market in governance and a free market in economic systems. And you are not a true anarchist or a true good enough critic of the state unless you understand that. And that is why libertarians must consider socialist, anarchist, anarcho-communist, Georgist, geo-libertarian, and heterodox economics positions if they're going to have a truly big tent that includes both less government people, smaller government people, and no government people. Because we're not going to have any incentive to work within the Libertarian Party if it becomes a statist corporate institution that's conducted based on vote with your dollars and appeals to the state to, hey, if we pass 5%, we'll get public money. Why do you want taxpayer money? You're going to destroy the Libertarian Party by making it receive public taxpayer money that had to be coerced and extorted out of law-abiding, peaceful citizens. What in God's name are you doing, vulgar libertarians? Thanks for listening.